We are finishing off the chapters on the French structures with this one. I mean, it's a very interesting structure. White has a pure space advantage here. And the author makes this interesting sort of comparison to the King's Indian. He says it's generally a mirrored version of the King's Indian in the sense that, well, the plans are extremely sort of clarified. I mean, White has this spatial edge on the King's side, and typically would attack sort of his opponent's pawn chain, getting the pawn to f5, while Black will have a go at it with c5 like this. So, due to this sort of things, I would say, being blocked or not opposing each other, exchanges are not imminent. We are going to see a very interesting struggle. As mentioned, well, due to this pawn on e5, White has an obvious space advantage, and it's the space advantage that sort of leans towards the King's side. So White will typically make operations on the King's side. It can be by pushing f4, but it could also be by pushing h4 and sort of gaining space like this and trying to sort of evolve that into an attack on the Black king, which would most likely be on the g8 square. It would be very logical for Black to castle short, especially as c5 is the sort of his pawn breakthrough. It would be not impossible to hide the king on b8, but it's more rare, at least I would say. While I'm mentioning pawn breaks with h4 or f4, quite often, White actually keeps the pawns here and then uses his pieces to attack on the King's side. It can be, I don't know, a bishop on f4, a knight on f4, or something like this. But there is very much examples of that, which is quite interesting in a way. Of course, in these kind of situations where White pushes like this, Black pushes like that, it becomes what we would call a race situation. So considerations will always be, should I attack as quickly as possible, or should I sort of try to postpone my opponent's attacks? And it becomes a balancing game like that. So of course, I mean, White might play c3, White might play a3 to try and sort of, well, make sure Black's attack comes way too fluently through in that sense. But very much it leads to interesting positions, and obviously, well, the king will very typically hide on g1 here. If we look at it from Black's perspective, well, obviously c5 attacking the base of the pawn chain is the logical way to go, but actually a major factor is there a bad, so-called bad Black bishop on the c8 square hemmed by your own pawn chain? Or is this bishop on f5 being out in freedom? This is such a major difference. In other structures, well, things would be sort of, I would say, very general and the plans would be the same. But here, just sort of this one piece is a huge defining factor. Is it outside the pawn chain or inside? That really matters, and we will see examples of both. Yes, c5 is by far the sort of most logical way to attack the center. But also undermining from it the base with f6 is quite typically seen. Well, very often you will combine them. And, well, when we go c5 and they go c3, then quite logically b4 becomes our next break. And it could even be that we are going to run all the way to a3 and potentially undermine the whole chain like this. It's just a very interesting structure. I think if we go 20 years back, this structure was in generally seen as quite pleasant for Black, and we would see players like Karpov doing it in the Caro-Kann, for instance, and let's say playing the advanced French immediately was not very popular from White's perspective, because there is quite a considerable risk of Black actually outplaying the opponent. It's not a very solid structure from White's perspective, but a very ambitious one. Now with modern computers, it's more popular. The computers generally seems to favor the white space advantage, but it's not hopeless in any way for Black. I'm just saying that pendulum has swung a little bit in White's favor, while earlier it was quite favorable for Black. But I would say in general, because of sort of the fixed structure like this, and there are no sort of obvious early exchanges, it leads to very fascinating positions. I think we are rounding off the French structures with a very interesting one. We're starting out this chapter with a pretty interesting game between Granda Sonica and Narciso Dublan. We are really sort of deep into the middle game here, and it's a complicated position. The author said that some training sessions he asked students who is better in this position black to move. And one made the pretty logical argument, well, it's obviously black, right? Black has the c-file, counterplay here, and a strong knight on c4. What do white have? Some pretty inactive pieces that, well, what are the prospects of that? There is logic to this explanation, but it's also very wrong. What matters here is that white actually have quite a spatial advantage, and with that comes attacking chances on the king side. And while the c-file is nice, the only entry square is c2, which is very well covered by the rook. So the author's conclusion is that white is actually considerably better here. That is generally correct, but there is some kind of very interesting defense for black in this position. The author says that a5 is the best try, and it very much is. The point is that, let's say white plays h5 like in the game, then a4 happens. Now a3 starts to threaten. Should you play a3 with white, black is going to follow up with b5, with b4 coming next, and considerable counterplay. So it's logical to keep playing on the king side. But then there is this cool idea, a3, b3, knight to b2. Of course the knight is somewhat stuck here, but it attacks the queen, and at the same time it's sort of gotten the c3 square entry point in the c line. So suddenly black has quite considerable counterplay here. So after a5, the author says, well, unfortunately the move a4 is good. His point is, if bishop f2, well, would you play b3? Knight a3 is actually quite cool. You go to a3, and after the rook goes here, you go queen c3. And even something like this, I guess we go queen b2, and next the rook comes to c2 with considerable amount of counterplay. But unfortunately he concludes that there is this nice move rook c2, it threatens b3, so the queen has to go away, and after b3, knight a3, rook to a2, well, we're gonna pick up the knight on a3 next, and your counterplaying the c-file has been slowed down, so basically white is much better here. But the computer says, hang on, not so fast, and suggests the brilliant move b5. Well, the idea is, if you take on b5, our knight is out. You can take on a5, but it doesn't matter so much. We go knight c3, we have counterplay, and we're gonna get the pawn back later, and black is actually quite better here. So the critical move is, well, take on a3. But then we're going to take back and just take on a4. And whatever you take with the pawn or with the rook, well, the computer says black has more than sufficient counterplay here. He's actually completely fine. And the rook is generally as good as these pieces because, well, things are going to happen fast and they're not really going to join the action. So black has this kind of brilliant counterplay with a5. I'm not at all saying black is better here. I'm saying black is kind of okay, which is already really a lot. And that cannot be said about what happens in the game because, well, black plays logically. Queen d7 starts doubling in the c-file. But now white grabs space on the king side with h5, a good move. Black continues the plan, rook c7, f4, rook 8 to c8. And now the next moves are very impressive for white. He starts by retreating the bishop to f1, but says that, well, at f1, it has some kind of future, while on g2, well, he was just shooting into granite, right? So f4 happens, bishop to f8, and then another nice move, bishop to e1. Well, you can see that it's true. Well, let me get rid of these arrows. It does cover the b4 square, but that's not really the main thing. It's not like we were very afraid of the bishop going there. It's more a matter of clearing the second rank, and at the same time, white has spatial advantage, and there's not much black can do against this. So, I mean, these retreats are really cool, I would say. Black plays b5, white sort of gets the queen to d3, the knight goes back, and then the move b3, just sort of making sure the knight doesn't return to the c4 square. The game goes rook c1, but white doesn't mind this exchange. He takes and goes bishop to d2. There's really no good square for the rook, sort of. If you go to a1, we can just start playing, let's say, bishop to c3 and start harassing the rook on this side. So the rook kind of have to go back. And now rook f2, A6, G4, we're already threatening F5, and basically black has a very difficult position. The game was knight to C8, F5, takes, F6, GF5, and if knight E7, then F6. The point is, if knight F5, we have bishop H3 with a pin, and, well, black went something like knight C6, and, well, we can fast forward the last moves. It was takes, king F1, and now basically white got ready to give mate in the H file, and there's no reasonable way. Black tried bishop G7, but, well, you can just take it, and white won easily. So I think a very, very interesting example. I think the main sort of point is that, well, this structure is generally quite dangerous for black. We could see that space mattered. When things normalized a little bit, white position was very dominant, right? We saw, let's say, I don't know, a position like this. White seemed to be quite clearly better, despite that the pieces are on the sort of two back ranks. But this potential space, white managed to expand, and we saw that the black counterplay was, well, not really there. But of course, I mean, it's impossible not to mention this brilliant idea of A5 and sort of creative counterplay with a knight on B2. And of course, also this, I mean, well, it feels almost insane counterplay with a knight on A3, and then this brilliant computer move B5 rescuing it. But that is very much sort of extraordinary. If we go for the more general conclusions, it is that, well, space matters, and space can typically be translated into a kingside attack, at least when you cover the entry points in your position. So, an interesting start, but with a favorable conclusion for white in general. Our next game is an excellent game by Magnus Carlsen, who beats Wang Hao in Weigen 2011. We will see this center again, and that this space advantage can be turned into a sort of very dangerous attack. I think this position is a good starting point, because you could very much make an argument for playing the move F4. I mean, if we say these central pawns are so important, why not reinforce them with a pawn and only develop the knight to F3 later? I mean, then black's, let's say, attempts to undermine it will be even less successful. There is some point to that, but also I think it is quite wrong. What we see Magnus doing is playing the move knight to F3. And he don't want the pawn on F4, let's say, limiting the scope of his bishop. He actually wants to attack on the king side with pieces. And while F4 indeed reinforces the center, it also leaves white with less dynamic possibilities. Now Wang Hao plays a sort of standard move, rook to C8, just putting the rook to what soon will be an open file. But that doesn't turn out too well. The author said maybe you could take on d4 and give a check on a5. The idea is that, well, if you interpolate with the bishop, we can play bishop b4 and actually force favorable exchanges. But he also points out that, well, white is just going to go king to f1 and g3 next, king going to go to g2. You will castle artificially, and, well, actually having the rook on h1 can even be favorable to the f1 square, as we will see. So white is just better in this position, but rook c8 doesn't really make it better for black in any way. Carlsen castles, and now he plays a6. Well, he's trying to gather some queenside activity. It's very reasonable, and for the moment he probably wants to keep his king on e8 because, well, castling has some risk with white pushing h4 later, as we'll see. Well, now I almost spoiled what white's plan is here, but Magnus plays a very nice move, g3. Well, the idea is just to go h4, probably also putting the king on g2, and then based on circumstances, at some point rook h1 and ah5. But it's basically just grabbing more space on the king side. And, well, we will see here. Now he plays h4. Right, have we played the move f4? Well, this would look more ugly in a way. So I think the logical structure is exactly these two sort of sideways pawn structures. I mean, well, this bishop on e3 is still active. This knight can launch to g5. And, well, the king to g2, the rook to h1, as I mentioned. The white attack sort of flows very logically, and there's no particular hurry either. What black should do is it's much more difficult. I mean, well, if you castle, But it's just gonna be, well, the author says king g2 and rook h1. It looks extremely logical. I think the computer says bishop to d3 is perhaps even better. We're gonna put the queen on e2 and maybe knight g5, h5. It's gonna more or less collapse, I think, quite automatically. So black has a very difficult position. You could make a case for the move f6. Obviously, it's gonna leave you with a weakness on g6. The king might go unprotected. This is probably the best practical chance, but that white is considerably better in a number of ways, I think without any kind of doubt. The author says maybe takes, rook e1, bishop, king f7, and now bishop f1, perhaps heading to h3. And, well, black is maybe doing a good job of keeping the game going, but it's a sad position, and no doubt about it. But, well, h4, Wang Hao, well, he does it quite logically, I would say. Right? White is playing on the king side, black sort of counters on the queen side. Now Magnus' next move is praised by the author. I think it's debatable, but it's interesting. Magnus plays the move a4, and generally, well, the sort of consensus is that, well, you should attack on the side where you have more space. And for Magnus, well, that would be the king side, right? But there is some point in playing the move a4. I mean, he's most likely gonna manage to open the a file for his rook. The a file could also be seen as, well, you know, black could also use the a file with playing rook a8. But at the moment with his king on e8, his rook is not connecting. So somehow the a file is most likely to favor white. There's nothing wrong with the move. The author says, would Magnus go king g2? Well, then there will be some kind of counterplay with takes, knight b6. It's eyeing the c4 square. White is going to play b3, sort of preventing it. And he thought maybe knight b4 was reasonable, but even himself suggests that, well, white can play a move like bishop g5, and he's probably quite better. Well, the computer says it's not like white is better here. White is completely winning. It's more than +2. It's a little bit shocking, but perhaps not so much. I mean, well, it just wants to go, let's say, rook c1, queen to d2. And, well, these knights are gonna look very silly and not doing any kind of thing reasonable. And it's more likely it's white who's gonna get the c file than black. And as well as we will see, this kingside attack with h5 is very automatic. And, well, long term, there's not much else you can do than castling, and then white's gonna get a huge attack there. So I think, I mean, at this stage, we are already in the sort of area of white being close to winning. So to start debating is, you know, is Magnus' move a4 good or bad? I don't think it makes much sense. The white position is so great that, well, you can probably do it in several ways. Wang Hao plays queen to b6. Magnus opens the a file and then plays this nice move king to g2. In general, I think it's a flexible move. Of course, rook h1 is a huge part of it. The paranoid side of me would also say that, well, a queen on b6 was pointing in the direction of my king, but it would be quite reasonable. You will say that it's completely paranoid, right? There's a bishop on e3 and a pawn of d4. It's never really gonna be relevant, but having the king on g2, it just feels very cozy. It connects, sort of, the rook can connect to h1, and I think the king is just better placed on g2 than on g1. So it's quite reasonable, I think. And also, the point is there's so little black can do here, so time is not of massive essence. Wang Hao plays the move c4. It closes the queen side, and he wants to push b4 with some kind of counterplay. But now Magnus already started creating some kind of threats. He put the knight to g5, and obviously is insinuating that h5 could happen any moment. For that reason, he goes queen to d8. Well, the idea is, well, to sort of, well, put double pressure, right, on g5, meaning you can't play h5 as g5 would be hanging. The author suggests also maybe you could consider taking on g5 and then playing b4, but after something like h5, well, a line would just be, let's say, takes, now let's say g6, and the bishop goes back. White is gonna go rook h1, and if black takes it, we take back with the queen, and we are threatening to penetrate via the h file. If you look at the value of black's counterplay here, I mean, there's not going to be any kind of reasonable threats. I mean, you can take on c3, but you don't really have any relevant entry points in the b line. In it, if anything, the white rook will come to b1 and take over the b line. So a huge part of the black's problem is that his counterattack is so impotent. So queen d8, sort of preventing h5, is quite a reasonable idea. Magnus now plays another nice move, bishop to g4. It starts insinuating that bishop takes e6 could be a threat at some point. If it's a threat immediately, it's not fully clear. But, well, it could also be that we just want to put our queen on f3 and sort of put pressure on f7. And I think the bishop is just very well placed here. It points in this direction, and it leaves space for the queen. Yeah, I mean, the author says, let's say knight f8, then queen f3, you're forced to take on g5 anyway. So Wang Hao chooses to take on g5 in this position. Magnus takes back with the bishop, the queen goes to c7, and now this nice move rook to h1, making use of the king being on g2. The threat is just h5. But, well, it reminds me of someone talking about Kasparov, saying that, well, his threats are actually pretty obvious. The difficult thing is doing something about it. And here, I mean, well, yes, h5 is threatened, but telling black, please stop it, well, that's impossible. More or less the only kind of counterplay would be something like f6, but it would leave the e6 pawn incredibly vulnerable. So it's just strategically completely gone for black. And, well, again, we see that this center has basically kept any kind of counterplay away for black, and white has had a free reign on the king's side, and soon it's going to be touched down. So knight b6, h5, opening the h-file. Of course, h take g6 is a criminal threat, so he has to take. White takes back with the bishop. You could probably take with the rook, but I would guess that sort of this tension that exists here in the h-file should be favorable for white. And of course, if he plays g6, well, then we will drop back and we will have an exchange. But we have forced the weakness g6, which is quite useful, especially with the bishop on g5, right? So, yeah, Wang Hao plays knight a4. I guess it actually feels nice to have a threat for a change, right? But, well, I'm not sure it can be called a very relevant threat, but a threat it is to an extent. And now Magnus, I mean, I'm sure he could win by calmer means, but we're talking about a young Magnus here who's incredibly confident. So he plays a brilliant piece sacrifice. Bishop takes f7. Well, obviously, you can't take with the queen, then the rook is hanging on h8. So king takes f7 is the only move. Then Magnus gives a check. You can't hide on e8, again the rook would be hanging. You can make a case for going to g6 with the king, but then bishop to f6 is brilliant. The threat is queen to g4 check, and the king is sort of, will have to go to f7 when g7 is hanging. And obviously you can't take on f6, because then queen takes f6 is made. So in this position, there's just no, in this position, there's just no reasonable defense. Well, I think something like this you could make an argument for, but then we're going to give, like this, we're going to give a check. If you go to f7, we can take here. And if you go to h7, I would suspect that check here and queen takes e6 is just completely game over. So Wang Hao quite logically chose to go back to g8 with his king. Magnus now took on h8 and played rook h1 check to g8. This position, it looks promising for white, but I'm still very impressed with Magnus evaluating it as completely winning. Right? I mean, he had a very dominant position, and he could choose to do something considerably simpler. But he has evaluated very precisely. He thinks that after queen h5, it's just completely game over. And it's true. I mean, computer says white wins, and white wins easily. But it's in a slow way. I mean, we get to see it very well in the game. Just to put a line, let's say king to f8, there's queen g6 wins trivial. It's just going to be rook h mate next. But after rook f8, what should white do? But the point is this brilliant attacking move, bishop to f6. And now there's actually just no reasonable defense. Well, the threat is queen h7 check, king f7, queen takes g7, and this queen is going to hang on c7. And also, well, let's say you take the piece, we give a check, another check, and then the queen is hanging, right? So here it's a question of, well, how to defend. You could argue, let's get the queen out of the way, but then we will check our way to taking this pawn, and after rook h7, there is just no defense to queen g6, and the king is mated. I thought what looks most stubborn is the move queen to d7, because, well, if you start checking like this, it's not fully clear how you break through here. Actually, somehow black is managing to defend. But in this position, this quiet move, queen g6, is completely crushing. The point is that, well, you cannot put your queen to defense, because then we are mating, because there is no sort of, escape square for the king in this direction, right? And after queen g6, I guess our threat is just rook to h7 next. Threatening mate on g7, but also threatening queen to h5 back and rook h8 mate. There's no reasonable way to defend. I mean, the computer's best line is the suggestion of take here and playing queen f7, but we can play rook h8 and we're gonna win the queen, and of course we're just trivially winning here. So Wang Hao resigned. I thought a brilliant game by Magnus. First of all, well, we're starting off from a position like this that perhaps doesn't look horrible for black, but Magnus makes it look like white is close to strategically winning. And it's probably not that far off. I mean, this center, we get to see the huge power of them. Then there is a pair of bishops, right? And sort of weak pawns here. I mean, well, these are relevant factors, but just at first sight, I mean, it looks quite reasonable, I would say, for black. I thought it's very instructive playing the move knight to f3, leaving freedom for the bishop, not caring about getting your pawn to f4, but rather being sort of fully free to operate. And of course, it's a standard plan, but playing g3 followed by h4 is really important in this structure. We saw it in the previous game, we saw it here again. This idea of attacking with h5 is very, very strong. And I really like the move king to g2 as well. Okay, maybe it's just trivially moving away sort of for the rook to connect, but also I think g2 is just such a cozy square. And yeah, I think just a brilliant game by Carlsen here. This is a game between Shigalko and Radulski. And it starts out with this very sort of, almost the starting point of the advanced French variation. Black has just played the move queen to b6, and it's sort of intensifying the pressure on the d4 pawn. I mean, for instance, the point is if you do bishop d3, then black can sometimes win a pawn. It's true in this position, you can't take immediately because it's going to end up with a check on b5. But bishop d7 is known as a very good move here, and black is doing well. So in this position, white is often playing the move a3. And the idea is to expand sort of the central influence with b4, and also to some extent undermine the c5 pawn, so it has to commit to taking on d4. Now here black plays the move c4, and it might look extremely weird, right? I mean, we are sort of told to undermine the center like this, and instead, well, black puts the pawn on c4, meaning that this center is going to be incredibly stable. But of course, black gets something in return. He gets access to the b3 square. The knight is going to jump to a5 and going to access the b3 square. And it's a very interesting and very different strategic situation, right? I mean, I keep stressing that this center certainly is going to be very stable. But as we will see, black has quite an interesting way of generating counterplay here. So white goes very logically. Knight to d2, covering the b3 square. Black attacks it, bishop e2, bishop to d7. Now white castles, which looks very, very logical, but actually is somewhat frowned upon by theory these days. The correct move is rook to b1. And, well, it's sort of insinuating playing b3 or even b4. Black will probably have to take en passant anyway, so it gets to the same position. And it's not like it's an immediate threat, but it's there in the air. And after the move knight to e7, again, the computer doesn't want to castle. It actually wants to play the move h4, just gaining some space. And the line goes something like long castles, h5, perhaps threatening h6. So black goes h6, and then again we keep postponing castling. We go knight to f1, and after king b8, the bishop can go to f4, because this rook on b1 has the function of protecting also this pawn on b2. And well, compared to what we will see in the game, white gets much more fluid play on the king side. I mean, this knight can go to g3 or e3, and then perhaps eventually we will castle. But there is not so much, let's say, traffic problems for the white pieces. Here they actually flow quite reasonably. And I mean, I think it's a cool way that, well, rook b1, to some extent looks like it wants to push the b pawn, and sometimes it will. But later it ends up just being a useful positional move, covering this pawn, so that we can develop the bishop freely. And well, that's generally the point with good moves, that they are not just one-dimensional in a way. But Shigalko chose to castle in this position. Black played knight to e7, rook b1, queen to c7. I guess the move queen to c7 looks very illogical, right? I mean, first you play queen b6, and then you start retreating to, well, a decent square, but nothing special. But on b6, we saw the queen had this very specific function of putting pressure on d4. But that theme evaporated when we played the move c4. Also on b6, it had some use targeting the b2 pawn. But when the rook went to b1, well, that also stopped being relevant. These are sort of defensive points of view. There's also a more active one, that actually black has the plan of knight to c8 to b6, and then later bishop to a4, and the queen has to vacate that. So queen c7 is just very logical and useful move, even though it probably feels quite weird. Now the game goes knight to e1. The author makes the point that, well, b4 is a tactical mistake, because after takes, there is the move bishop to a4 with an annoying pin like this, and black is just much better. So knight e1 happens, long castling, and now he plays the same move as we saw Magnus doing, putting the bishop on g4. It's quite useful. It sort of attacks towards the e6 pawn, meaning that most likely it's more difficult for black to undermine with f6. But also it is out of the way, meaning that, well, the queen gets more freedom in, let's say, going to the e2 square, and if you start perhaps putting a knight back to f3, then the bishop would not be blocked in on e2. So the g4 square is just generally quite nice. Black, no, I like it. He plays the move king to b8. It's not like it's that dangerous being in this diagonal, but you know by now that I really like to be cautious, and I think king b8 is a very nice move. Now white plays the knight to c2, which the author criticizes, but it doesn't make much of a difference. I mean, this allows black to play bishop a4 immediately, but as we will see, knight c8 to b6 happens later. So in general, it's just going to end up with some kind of a transposition. Well, the a4 square is very nice for the bishop. Somehow, well, it creates pressure, and it's active on a4 while still being completely safe, right? There's no way white can attack it. So white will have to play around it. And the question is, well, we will see it soon, so let's talk about it there. So knight f3, knight c8, queen e2, knight to b6. I mean, all these pieces here, they're completely safe, as I said, and the question is, are they functional or are they out of play? And white's claim is that, well, they are only sort of relevant in the A and B file. There is a lot of space on the other side. Maybe relevant things will happen there, right? Black's argument is that, yeah, they have quite some influence, and he's very solid on the other side. So actually, well, he thinks black could be doing fine. In this position, the computer actually says h6 would have been a great move. Well, he wants to follow up with knight b6 next, but he thinks controlling the g5 square is quite relevant. The point is, in this position, well, the author mentions knight to g5, but the computer is even arguing that in this position, the best move would be bishop to g5. Well, it's a threat, but also, I mean, maybe the bishop could, well, probably go to f4 next, having annoyed a little bit, but getting the bishop out means there is somewhat more space to sort of maneuver on. But, well, knight b6 looks extremely logical. Game was h4, and now, well, the theme that we will see happening just in a bit would actually be even stronger here. Black should have played the move f5 already now. But we will talk a little bit about it on the next move. Black played the move king to a8. And, I mean, I like it very much on general grounds. Just, well, on b8, there could be potential trouble in this diagonal, especially when f5 start happening. Putting the king on a8, if time is not a consideration, it's a great move. Of course, it could be that you had higher priorities, but that the king is better on a8 than on b8 is obvious. On a8, it's just very, very safe, while on b8, it could be involved in some kind of tactics, not immediately, but it might happen eventually. So if you could choose freely where to put the king, a8 for sure. If it's worth a tempo, is a different discussion. You could even make a case for playing a6 and putting the king on a7. But, well, it's getting too sophisticated now. But I just wanted to make the point that don't look at this as sort of a null move. No, it's a very useful move, getting the king out of trouble in due time. The game continued with h5. And, well, now we see that, well, I would say the power of king to b8, but actually on a8, but it would have worked with the king on b8. But we see a very interesting tactical theme. Radulski plays the move f5. The point is, it looks impossible. It's the kind of move that you would overlook, because after ef6, gf6, it looks like this pawn is just en prise, right? That both the queen and the bishop can take it. The problem is he can't, and very trivially he can't. If he takes with the queen, well, the knight hangs on c2, so that doesn't work. And if you choose to take with the bishop on e6, it's very trivial. Just rook to e8, there is a deadly pin in the e-file, and you're going to do bishop d7 next, and you win immediately. So I guess, well, it is strange, right, that I think it's extremely human to overlook this move f5, simply because it looks like it drops a pawn. I mean, I wouldn't have thought about it myself if I didn't know the theme. But, well, when you know the theme, it also becomes extremely simple. It's just to be able to visualize in your head that while this pawn looks doomed, it's extremely simple to calculate. And, well, that means actually, well, black is just capable of grabbing a lot of space like this. It would have, as I mentioned, it would have been quite better to do it the move earlier. But, well, I would explain why. So he had to actually back with the bishop like this. Now, well, black has gained some space, that's for sure, but he hasn't sort of broken fully through in any way. He plays the move queen to f7, attacking the pawn on h5, which is quite useful. And the problem for white is that, well, you can't really start defending it easily with the queen. Let's say you go something like knight h2, because we can take on c2 and then on h5. Passive moves like knight to e1 exists, but then, well, probably black will find some way to start opening lines on the queen's side, king's side, sorry. Generally, the author gives the sort of narrative that white is just black is just much better here. And that's also how it looks to me. But the computer massively disagrees. It says, what's the big deal? Let's play g4 in this position. And, well, who am I to argue against the computer? It's an awesome move. Generally, black's idea was to open files on the queen's side. And now white more or less volunteers. But, well, the idea is, let's say, takes. Actually, white has pretty good control on the squares on the king's side. And there's even the threat of knight to g5, right? So black probably has to start playing a passive move like bishop to e7. But then, well, white can probably do well in a number of ways. Maybe getting the kings out of harm's way on h2, I would say. I don't know. Also, let's say after g4, move g6. But I think white wants to play h6 and... well, somehow it's difficult for black to open lines in a useful way on the king's side. G4, I think, is an extremely interesting and impressive move. And it meant also that, well, black should really have played F5 move earlier, as mentioned. No, I don't think I've seen anything like this, and it's quite reasonable. I mean, Shigalko is a very, very strong grandmaster, but to sort of humanly be able to spot the move G4 and evaluate it as good for white, I think is extremely high level. The game went very differently. The game was knight to G5, the queen back to G8, and white started just developing, but then here, queen F7 happens next, now knight F2 E1, and black just plays rook G8, wanting to open files with G6, and perhaps even pushing G5. It's going to lead to the same thing. So the game was king to H1, bishop E7, knight E3, now rook D to F8. This can look passive, but there is actually this idea of bishop E8, and this pawn will start getting into trouble. So game was bishop H2, bishop E8, G4, F4, knight here, and F3. And after queen D1, G6, black opens files on the queen side, king side, and well, is strategically lost for white already. The game was something like this: rook to G1, bishop to A4, and now he played G5, and black just took it and won. I think this part makes little sense to sort of dwell too much on. But I thought a very interesting game. I mean, first of all, it's important to understand that C4 very often could be seen as a very beginner's move. I mean, imagine white had not played A3 but bishop to D3. I mean, playing C4 here would be criminal, right? I mean, now you don't have the B3 square, and white can even undermine your sort of center with B3. But mainly, you have just given away your pressure for free. Here, however, it's quite a different story due to the weakness of the B3 square. And we saw how black would, well, maneuver with queen C7 to plan this maneuver to get the bishop to A4. I think that's quite interesting. I think also, I mean, this position here with H4 is quite interesting. Like postponing castling, wanting to play knight F1, bishop to F4, and, well, develop your pieces, but keeping the king on E1, because, well, with this very sort of closed structure, getting the king to safety is very low on the priority list. But of course, the star move of the game is this move F5. This idea that I mean, it still almost hurt my eyes. Not hurt my eyes, but it's like our intuition has a lot of moves stored. But this one, I still have to actually check what happens after e takes f6. I'm very capable of understanding that the tactics are extremely simple and works for black, but I can feel my brain doesn't register it fully. And no, so this is the kind of, well, several themes, but this tactical motive is quite a good takeaway from this game as well. This is Gopal against Bologan from Gibraltar in 2012. And, well, it's a Caro-Kann. I mean, the center is indeed French. But the big difference is that black has managed to get his bishop outside the pawn chain before he closed with e6. So in principle, this bishop on f5 is very well placed. But things are a little bit deceptive. And it was Nigel Short who introduced this idea of playing the knight on f3 and bishop on e2. For instance, he was very successful with it in his candidates matches against Karpov. And the idea is that this bishop on f5 can be chased at times. We saw it in the previous game by Magnus Carlsen against Wang Hao, that we had this pawn structure that knight h4 was played, bishop had gone back to g6, and then Magnus took on g6, and it actually turned out quite pleasant for white. So this bishop is both good and bad on f5. Bologan plays the move knight to e7, and his point is that if you go knight h4 now, well, you could consider c5, but even the computer says h6, and if take on f5, we're just going to take back. And white has used quite some time to get the pair of bishops, but the pawn center will be undermined quite quickly. So this is not particularly promising. Gopal castles, and now Bologan plays h6, making sure his bishop can retreat to h7 if chased. The next move is knight b to d2. It can look a little bit weird, but, well, c3 is not really a better square either, right? And after bishop g6, knight b3, it's quite a reasonable square, and especially it controls c5. So for black to make this freeing move, c5 becomes much more difficult. But Bologan is just playing a somewhat sort of waiting strategy. He plays the move knight to d7. And here is quite interesting that, well, the game is a4, but the author says, well, this looks a little bit artificial. It's interesting how things changes. Here in 2024, it's just by far the main move, and that's how everybody plays in this position based on computers. But I get the point. At that point, you know, playing knight d2 to b3 and then a4. Why is white doing this? But, well, it is gaining space on the queen side. It's sort of forcing a commitment for black, should he allow a5 or not. And it also preempts c5 to some extent. I mean, the black concept is solid, but also, I don't know, somewhat artificial or maybe passive. So white has to do something. I mean, black is more like ready to react rather than to do something very concrete. The question is now, should black play the move a5? And, well, this is very normal these days. But then, well, white plays this move bishop to d2. I think the author also thinks this looks weird. And it's true, it does, if you didn't know that this is by far sort of the main move in this position these days. That, well, you stand on d2, it's a decent square. If you go to e3, well, then knight f5 is going to be annoying, attacking the bishop, right? So b2 feels like a bit of a half move, but it's better than on c1, and you're connecting the rooks and so on and so forth. And, well, what is black going to do? That's kind of the reasonable question. Bologan didn't do a5. He played knight to f5. White pushed a5 himself, and probably allowing a6 is good for white. I mean, let's say if you get to play a6 and black plays b6, you can never really play c5 because you concede the b5 square. So a6 is quite logical. And now the game goes bishop to d2, and the author is sort of a little bit mystified by that. And, well, I said that's understandable, but these days it's just very much a main move. I think a key point is that if black now plays c5, which looks extremely logical, then you can swap on c5 and then play the move c4. And you're creating some tension in the center. Perhaps also, I mean, at some point you can take on c5 and give a check on a4. And now bishop d2 actually feels like a very useful development move because you're ready to play in the c file. It's just, I mean, it's strange with a bishop on d2, right? It feels like that's not how you develop a bishop, but it is kind of developed there and very useful. And yeah, I think it's just some kind of human bias that makes it feel so weird, at least for me. So the game was bishop to e7, and now Gopal does g4. This is also extremely typical of this variation. This game ends up very badly for white. And there was many games like this in the beginning where white would overextend and, well, black players like Karpov would really sort of, at some points, be successful in countering this short system. But nowadays, white know how to handle this structure, and generally, white is actually quite pleasant here. So, knight to h4, takes, and f4. I mean, it looks promising, right? And you're threatening f5. But Bologan plays a very nice move, bishop to e4. I mean, well, with pawns like this, of course, the e4 square becomes like a very juicy place for the bishop. The problem is, can you sort of retain it there, or is it going to be pushed back? In the game, white played bishop f3, offering the exchange of bishops. If black would take, it would be very useful for white. But Bologan pushed the bishop back to h7. And bishop f3 is actually not a great move. It's not at all like black is better after that, but it's by no means optimal. The correct strategy is first to play bishop to e3, and after bishop e7, then bishop to d3. Like that, well, you can argue, trap the bishop. It's a bit strong, but he's forced to exchange it. And after bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, white just have a very pleasant position. The idea is to push for f5 next. And the c5 counterplay, well, that's the whole point of this knight, that it really suppresses this c5 counterplay. So the black position is very passive. The best move here for black is probably h5, and white should respond with f5 with quite some attack. But I just can't help notice that the computer was saying the move g5, and I thought, really? You're gonna play g5? It looks so ugly, because after g6, well, I mean, the f4 square is horribly weak. I understand the knight cannot get there, but at least we have completely blocked the attack. But the computer thought c4 is a good follow-up. And the point is that, let's say, takes. In general, could black get a knight to d5? That would be great. But there's really no reasonable route the knight is going to end up on d5. I mean, a5 pawn sort of cuts the b6 square. That makes a huge difference. So this would be quite pleasant for white. After castling, the computer says the move c5. It says white has a huge advantage. I was a bit puzzled. Is that really true? I mean, the position is completely blocked. But I noticed the computer would play quite interestingly. It would take the king here and hide it maybe on c2 or even on a2. And then it would transfer the knight to f3 and h4 and maybe try looking for sacrifices with f5. So it's not just a fortress. I mean, pay attention to this knight. There's no reasonable route where you can sort of get in the vicinity of the f5 square. Well, b8 dead ends, and on f8 you can only get to h7. Maybe you can put the knight on f8 and hide the king somewhere and make a draw. But sad it is. Anyway, we saw here in the game bishop to f3, and the bishop went back to h7. This bishop on h4, of course, also looks very weird, but there's not much you can do against it, and it's actually quite decently placed. It's a little bit out of the way, which means there's more space in the black position. And, well, white played bishop to g2, castling f5. And, well, now at some point you can even drop it back here to start exchanging this one. But Bulogan here plays a very nice move. He plays rook to e8. First, it looks extremely weird, right? Why would we vacate the open file? I mean, it's the f-file things are going to happen in. But actually, there is a big point with it. And, well, his opponent doesn't spot it. He plays the move king to h1. And then black really gets what he dreams of in the short system. He managed to undermine the white center, right? Now suddenly the white position is heavily overextended. These pawns looks nice, but black is actually using them to sort of break down the white structure. And if we look at the rest of the position, I mean, ignoring these two pawns, then the bishop on g2 and d2 is well, not particularly active, and the knight on b3 is out of play. So here actually, well, black is just much better because, well, these pawns are gonna be exchanged. And with that, all the white space advantage evaporates, and then black is gonna end up with better pieces. I mean, the bishop on h7 is nicely placed, and, well, this knight might be heading in the direction of f6. Best would probably still be something like, I don't know, make a couple of exchanges and just live with that black has the better pieces, especially the bishop on h7. Gopal didn't want to be so passive, so he played bishop c3, but after fe5, well, I guess he realized that if he took back there, it's just taking on f5, and e5 is going to hang next. So he took on e5, and the game was like this, and black just had a healthy pawn and won some moves later. A bit of a sad end for white here, but I thought an interesting strategical game. In general, I think this is a fascinating situation, right? The short system that, well, I mean, it is interesting when general principles like this is a good bishop is not always the case. That simply you can start harassing it because while this one is outside of the pawn chain, you perhaps lack the space to sort of sustain it in a reasonable way, and white can gain time attacking it. I still also think there is, I mean, nowadays these concepts are well known, but let's say playing knight d2 to b3 just to stop c5 looks pretty passive at first sight. And then following up with a4 is also a little bit weird. And, well, of course, this move bishop to d2 is also, I mean, no, as I said, it really puzzled me when I saw this at the beginning. Is white really willing to use a move like, well, just to put the bishop slightly better? But, well, certainly he is, and it seems actually quite useful. And then perhaps more standard, this expansion with g4, and after take takes f4. And I think bishop e4 is a good thing to remember, but also that a huge part of white's plan is to actually get rid of this bishop. And if done in the proper way, we could see white still had a clear advantage. So while, I mean, this game ended up very well for black, he managed to undermine the white center. We also saw that white has quite considerable potential in this line. Our final game in this chapter is Babayev against Burmakin from 2006. And like our previous game, it's from the so-called short system in the Caro-Kann. Well, we can see that, again, black has this bishop outside of the pawn chain. So this bishop is supposed to be active on h7. And what sort of defines the short system from white's perspective is the knight on f3 and the bishop on e2. And of course, the sort of pawn center gaining space like this. It's a very interesting position. I mean, black has played pretty much a waiting strategy, developing as flexible as possible, and very much trying to respond to what white would do. And here we can see white has ran out a little bit of useful moves, right? I mean, the knight has gone to b2, he's played c3, and he's castled. Now sort of the easy moves has run out, and white has to do something. The author says a reasonable point would be to play the move b4. It gains more space, and at the same time, it makes it very difficult for black to push through the c5 advance. All that is true, but then we sort of see the black flexibility coming into play, that now it's possible to switch to a5 and attack the pawn chain like that. It's not necessarily bad for white in any way. I think the computer wants to go knight to b3, sort of creating tension in this way. Black has to take. And now, well, a typical move is developing this knight in this direction, sort of eyeing these two squares. It can seem a little bit slow, but we saw also that the white concept is quite slow to some extent, right? And also, well, this knight is getting out of the way and trying to find some useful squares while not completely, let's say, creating a traffic jam on the king side. So this is quite reasonable for both sides. I mean, something like bishop d2, knight c to b6. Well, the computer says white is slightly better here, which is probably correct. But, I mean, this knight is well placed. It's eyeing these squares, especially the c4 square. And we can develop with bishop e7 and castling next. At least black's position seems quite easy to play, and there's nothing very wrong with it. So in the game, Babayev chooses to play the move knight to b3, a typical one. It has the same idea of making c5 not so easily achieved, but at the same time it doesn't play the move b4, allowing the a5 counterplay. Black's next move is very interesting. He plays the move knight to g6. I somehow hope that at first sight it looks absurd, right? I mean, yes, it's a well-placed knight, but what about the bishop on h7? But, well, it's a little bit like what I said about the knight going to c8. That, well, we want to have it out of the way. We want to play bishop e7 and castling next, and there is no dream square for it. I mean, the logical square for this knight was on c6, attacking the center. But then, for that to happen, black would have to play c5, which white is doing its best to sort of make less desirable. So this knight on g6 is an interesting character, but it's decently common. And while this game is from 2006, there is a bunch of games with similar things happening later. So it's in no way discarded. I really hope it looks very, very weird. But there is some kind of still harmony in it, and this bishop on h7, it will be useful later, hopefully. And there is some kind of solidity in the black position. And I guess also, why is it that something like this is attractive for black? We can see it works out tremendously well in the game. That for white, it's hard to deal with. I mean, if black plays very common setup, we would have an idea of where to put our pieces. But here, it is much more difficult. And Babayev doesn't manage. So bishop e3, a normal development move, makes a lot of sense. Burmakin goes bishop to e7. knight to e1, also extremely typical. It's, well, mainly preparing f4, I would say, but also, well, the knight can head in this direction and help stop the c5 advance as well. So, black castles. And now, I guess white faces this dilemma we spoke about before, that, I mean, he's running out of natural moves. Bishop to e3, knight to e1. These are, I think, obviously useful moves, but now we have a phase again with what to do. And here, his choice is not optimal. He plays the move g3. I mean, we saw it from Carlsen, for instance, playing g3 and h4 worked incredibly well. Here, however, it's not bad, but obviously less efficient. The correct move this time, while in other circumstances I sort of said it was not the right plan, was to play the move f4. The idea is now it reinforces the e5 pawn by sort of defending it like this. And this means that should black push, well, it makes it more difficult to push e5 because for a start we can take it with this e5 pawn being protected. But even if we don't take it, it also adds to the solidity of the position. Now c5 you cannot do immediately, we will take it. So black has to prepare it. And here there is various ideas for white, but the computer has a clear preference for one plan, which very much impressed me. It wants to play the move bishop to d3. Well, so far so good. This is considered very logical, and well, quite often we have seen that this exchange is quite desirable for white. But obviously black is going to play the move c5, threatening c4. And if we start taking on c5, I think things becomes pretty nice for black. But the computer wants the interesting move knight to c1. This is a concept I have not seen before, but I mean, well, white seriously wants to have knights on c1 and e1, but of course it's only temporarily in a way. The idea is, well, that white wants to keep this sort of strong center. And I mean, there is not much black can do about it. If you start taking on d4, we're just going to take back. And while the c file is open, obviously there's nothing happening for black. The logical move would be c4 grabbing space, and if bishop c2, b5. But now white is pretty well set up for playing f5 and taking back with the bishop on f5. And the computer says that here white actually has quite a considerable edge. And well, this knight will join via e2 and probably g3 and enter the king's side. And this is a very pleasant position for white, and a concept, well, especially knight c1, that I have never seen before. But here we start to sort of grasp that, well, this center actually has quite some value, and we can see that white sort of has free-flowing regrouping behind it. And sort of, well, that's really the point of having a broad and advanced center, but also a very stable one. And the knight c1 is keeping it stable while regrouping. So I think an interesting concept. Babayev played probably more normal. He played the move g3. Now it's possible for Burmakin to play c5 because, well, if you take it, black will gain the central pawn, which obviously is not in white's favor. And now the game continued h4. The next move is quite instructive. I mean, again here, let's say we take on d4, and we argue that now we can play the rook to c8. Well, the problem, well, we saw it in an earlier game with Granda Sonika, that as long as the c2 square is solidly protected, and well, so is the c3 square, obviously, from the pawn here, right? There is no entry squares in the c file. And while this looks nice, it's just empty arrows. It doesn't do anything, while white can expand on the king side in sort of in peace and quiet, because the black counterplay is not relevant. So what Burmakin does is much better. He plays the move c4, and after knight d2, he pushes b5. Actually, in this position, while c4 is the correct idea, well, the computer suggests, yeah, c4 is the correct idea. That's really what I want to do. But how about interpolating a5 first? And this is quite clever. Well, probably we are threatening a4 followed by a3. That would loosen up this pawn structure, and then later c3. I mean, imagine, well, we have forced the pawn to b3, then the c3 square could very much be an entry point in the c line. A completely different scenario from what we saw above. And if white plays the move a4, then probably we're gonna go c4, and then we will try and push for b5, attacking in the b file. It's complicated because white can also undermine with b3. But the computer said, well, this could actually be quite interesting to do. But Burmakin played the move c4 immediately, knight d2 and then b5. He wants to follow up with b4 and, well, obviously start attacking the pawn chain and trying to create counterplay in time before white gets fully going on the king's side. Babayev plays a3, an extremely typical move, sort of postponing black's advance. But in reality, when a5 happens, well, he wants to have the option of opening the a file by sort of exchanging pawns on b4, right? However, it's not very good here. In this position, I think the author already thinks black is doing pretty well, but the computer says that's probably too strong. It wants to start with h5. So, okay, this knight has to go to h8. Of course, that looks ridiculous, but the idea is to play f6 and develop it to f7 when it actually starts looking very harmonious. So it's not too bad in that sense. But now we play f4, and after f6, a very typical move, bishop to g4. It's a very good idea attacking sort of the base of the black pawn chain. And while, of course, it is possible to play f5 and get a solid structure like this, well, then this bishop is really bad. And, I mean, also, let's say in this position, black is really happy to have this kind of counterplay with pressure against the center. So bishop to g4 is an excellent move, at least trying to discourage the sort of black counterplay. Queen b6 is a logical way to defend this pawn. But now the computer wants to flick in a4. And, well, it threatens to ruin the pawn structure. And if you do something like a6, well, there is always the potential to take here. And let's say that, rooks has been exchanged in the f file, then suddenly this rook could be hanging on a8. And the white structure is still very, very solid. And let's say if you play something like b4 with black, well, it's not obvious you're going to enter in the b file, and maybe we're going to flick in a5 at some point as well. It's complicated, but actually quite promising for white, the computer is arguing. So this conclusion of black already has taken over the initiative, at least it's not true in an objective sense, but as we will see in the game, in a practical sense, it very much is. So the game was a3, black played a5. And now the same thing happens, but with this a3, a5 included, and this seems to quite favor black, as I explained. Even so, it would still very much be correct to play the move bishop to g4 to put pressure here. And, well, black can defend again, and I really like what the computer is suggesting here. It wants to regroup this knight from g2. Now, I would say bishop to d3 is logical, putting this bishop on a beautiful square, gaining a bit of time. And after rook e1, knight to f7. I mean, black has really achieved what he would like to. I mean, this knight has sort of looped into this square where it's quite well placed, and there is counterplay against the e5 center, right? But knight h4 is a good counter. And, well, first of all, it's a reasonably sort of active outpost, but also due to this sort of formation, it can jump to g6 at times to be annoying. And if it comes to g6, this rook on f8 has to make a decision. Maybe it will have to go to e8. But then somehow the activity down the f line is not very threatening. I mean, it strikes me as very modern chess, but the computer says white is slightly better here. And, well, who am I to argue against that? It's just a very, very complicated position, but white is still playing good chess, and I mean, it seems like it's very, very playable for white. While in the game, it's clear that, well, he starts panicking. And also our author says, well, black is already quite better here. And his argument is that, well, we're attacking the center like this, and we have counterplay like that. And that the white position is very passive. And I can understand this narrative, also that the white player bought it during the game, but we are not at the stage yet of black being better. But after he takes on f6, we are. It transposes into, well, this sort of French structure we have debated before, where white has the e5 square, and you can argue that these pawns are weak. But here, well, there is just no way white is getting to attack this pawn on e6, and black, I mean, has, well, generally beautiful pieces. This knight can also start, let's say, approaching these squares. Generally, I think the black position is extremely free-flowing, while for white's perspective, there is very little positive to say. Well, white kind of insinuates an attack like this. Black goes backwards. Then white is heading towards the e5 square. But as we will see, well, white can put a piece there. And right now, if we sort of freeze this frame, it looks nice. But of course, black is going to take it. And here, yes, white still has this center. But, well, this bishop is very active in this diagonal, right? And immediately we're going to push b4, creating counterplay. And for white, I'm not able to say anything positive. I mean, this pawn blocks our bishop g4 counterplay. We saw another example of this knight reaching h4. Obviously, it can't do that now. There is just, well, I would say there's no harmony in the white position, but also it mainly consists of weaknesses right now. I will say that, well, these advanced pawns, they don't bring any kind of joy for white, but they are great targets for black's counterplay. And right now, of course, the queen side starts to become a target as well. White takes on b4. It's extremely human. We can argue if it's wrong to some extent, but we'll see why it's wrong, because the game was like this. And the next move, I think, is very instructive. Well, it's extremely typical, but even so, it's b3. At first sight, I guess it goes against what we spoke about, right? That, well, we are trying to attack the pawn chain. But the pawn on b3 has one great function, that it gives the a2 square for a rook. This is covered in Nimzowit's My System, for instance, that, well, this becomes an entry point. And, well, let's imagine white tries an active move like knight to f4. Even here you can play the move rook a2 immediately. You don't even have to protect this pawn. If knight e6, queen to a5, there is just tremendous counterplay for black. There is the threat of, obviously, of rook takes a1. You can't stand on b1 defending your weak pawn because of this bishop basically being a sniper down from h7. And if you take here and go ba2, queen a1, I mean, I'm sure there's many moves, but the funniest, of course, is the move bishop to b1, and then you create this construction and this poor queen on a1. Well, to say it doesn't have a bright future would be a massive understatement. White is just completely lost, right? So it's quite logical. He plays the move rook takes a8. At least it eliminates the rook that could jump to the a2 square. So black takes back, and, well, generally there is just no reasonable way to defend. The queen a2 is a threat. b2 is gonna be extremely hard to defend. I think it's quite instructive, right? I mean, we argued we played b4 to create this tension towards this pawn chain. But actually, having gotten the pawn this far, this one on b2 has become a huge target. I mean, let's imagine something like bishop to c1, queen to a1. I mean, we're going to be extremely annoying having threats like this. And, well, our bishop can come to g5 at some point, trying to dislodge this bishop. And maybe the knight can jump to a4. It's actually just trivially winning for black. Yeah. He decided to be desperate, to play g5, at least to get the g4 square for the bishop. Black took the pawn. Bishop g4, knight to f8. A sort of beautiful defensive construction, right? Defending this weakness, but perhaps also defending a little bit in this direction. Just being incredibly solid. So queen c1 happened, queen to a2. And after bishop takes g5, well, the final killer blow, bishop to a3. It, in principle, sacrifices a piece, right? But if you take it, we're going to go b2, and we're going to queen next. gaining a tempo on the queen. Now, well, white played h6, and white took on so black took on b2, and won very shortly afterwards. The b pawn just queens. So I think we will leave it here. A beautiful strategical game by Burmakin, and well, you get to understand, I would say, the attraction of this setup, right? That it leaves huge room for outplaying your opponent, and especially, well, this game is 2006. Before the plans were clearly defined here, a lot of players was very attracted to this with black. Nowadays, a little bit less so, because white has figured out that, well, you want to put your bishop on d3, that this exchange is favorable for you, and things like that. And let's say in this position, perhaps with the bishop still on f5, black nowadays experiments with the move g5, a little bit influenced by sort of modern computers and trying to mix, well, still being very flexible, but also gaining some space on the king side. As we saw at times, white getting too much space at the king side was quite sort of a problem. I like to mention a few things when we sum it up. I mean, for instance, this idea of retreating the knight in this direction is very common, and it starts eyeing these kind of juicy squares, but also, as I mentioned, even something like this, the computer still thinks this is quite pleasant for white. I thought that in this position you actually should go f4 was instructive, because in other moments, well, I said f4 basically, crowds this bishop, blocks it a little bit, but here, I mean, compared to the earlier Carlsen Wang Hao game, well, black actually has good control of the kingside squares, so here it's more logical to gain space. And I thought bishop d3 is a key concept to understand, and while knight c1 is somewhat exceptional, I still think it's pretty beautiful in many ways. I think it's good to remind people of this idea that, well, counterplay in the c-file, sometimes it's completely optical, that if there's no relevant entry squares, if white can easily counter it, then it just is an open file, but white will not oblige and start exchanging things there. White will just play around it. So one has to be careful about it, and this was the reason why Burmakin chose space with sort of potential real gains rather than an empty open file. Yeah, I think, well, for instance, I also thought that sort of this idea of, putting the bishop on g4 is quite noteworthy, and even, well, I think in a different line, we would even sort of get the knight to h4 and gain counterplay to the g6 square. But here already it's becoming very messy and murky. And perhaps the last thing is that, well, we saw once again that this pawn structure, while sometimes very bad, when it's not bad, it can actually be incredibly good. So, yeah, I think a nice complex game to finish off this chapter. And I think we have really seen pros and cons of the structure. And it strikes me as a very interesting structure because while, you could say that it's unclear who is better in this structure in general, but we see the pendulum sometimes swinging heavily in favor of white and sometimes heavily in favor of black. And this makes it quite interesting to play, right? It's interesting, it's complicated, and it really leaves a lot of room for outplaying your opponent. So I hope you found this chapter interesting.